AMD Ryzen 5000 series desktop processors, Zen 3, oh boy, we have some talking to do. So, Ryzen 5000 series, pretty exciting stuff. Today, the Zen 3 architecture CPUs were announced, or at least October 8th, which is the day of filming. So, we have some talking to do. It's pretty interesting, so let's get started. Let's jump. Let's talk about the naming first. So, I have to express my gratitude that they went 5000 series instead of 4000 series, because 4000 series applied to mobile processors, their APUs. It was always pretty confusing with the APUs because they were always a generation behind. So I'm pretty happy when they decided to go 5000 series. Anyway, jumping into the technical stuff, the first thing I kind of want to go over is the core complex, or the CCX, and the arrangement of how it's arranged. So previously, a CCX was 4 cores and the cache, basically. And in previous generation, it was 4 cores share 16 megabytes of cache. However, this time they realized that one CCX having only 4 cores created a bit of latency between the two chiplets, because there were 2 CCXs in a CCD. But this time they effectively cut that in half, pretty much in half, because there's one CCX is basically one chiplet, which is one CCD. So this reduces latency a lot, and basically means that 8 cores share 32 megabytes instead of 2 split 16 megabytes. So because of all of this redesigning and CCX reconfiguration, they were able to get a 19% IPC uplift over the previous generation, which is, that's insane, especially considering that, in my last video I actually said if they can increase their IPC by a little, they will be golden, because core clock is not everything. Because there's always going to be that argument by the Intel fanboys that, well, Intel has faster clock speeds, so they're better for gaming. Well, that's where IPC comes into play. It's not only the frequency that the CPU operates at that's important, but it's also how many instructions per clock it can execute. I can talk, I promise. So for example, if you have like a 5950X, we'll talk about that one later, that can boost up 4.9 gigahertz, single core of course, I know it's so close to 5 gigahertz, against an i9 10900K that turbos up to 5.3 gigahertz single core. The 10900K doesn't necessarily perform better in single threaded tasks, most likely. And I haven't even said this yet, this is on a 7 nanometer architecture. That's insane that we're seeing so much performance and IPC uplift on the same processing node. So if this was a saga, it would be kind of like 7 nanometer, the sequel. On top of all that though, the TDP is still extremely good, all things considered. Actually, it's only 105 watts for the R9 5950X, R9 5900X, R7 5800X, and only 65 watts on the R5 5600X, which is pretty insane that you're squeezing, you're getting more IPC, better clock speeds, more cores, well, maybe not more cores, but definitely more performance, but pretty much identical TDP as the previous generation, which is something that they were mentioning a lot in their video that premiered a few hours ago, at least as of October 8th. Before we get into specific CPUs though, I think we should first kind of go over the platform. I'm sure there's few people out there who's concerned about whether their motherboard will be compatible with 5000 series CPUs. So the good news, it's still going to be on the AIM for socket, yay! But before you get too hyped, so far it's only confirmed to work on the X570 chipset and the B550 chipset. So if you have an X570 or B550 motherboard, you're pretty much set to upgrade to a Ryzen 5000 series CPU with a BIOS update. Now, we can start talking about specific CPUs finally, and the specs of each individual CPU, price points and stuff like that. So when in doubt, start in the middle, so I'm just going to start with the R9 5900X. AMD made some claims about the performance of the of these CPUs. Specifically the 5900X, they claim that it would grant you a 26% performance uplift in games as opposed to Ryzen 3000 series. Of course, this is claims made by AMD themselves, so you should take this with a grain of salt and wait until the individual benchmarks come out. Now, all of that being said, the specs of it are pretty beefy, actually. 12 cores, 24 threads, so it's definitely not going to be a slouch when it comes to multi-threaded performance. And it even has a 4.8 gigahertz max boost clock. Of course, it's single core, but it's still one of the higher boost clocks that we've seen so far, so that's definitely a good sign. And of course, a TDP of 105 watts, as we've already discussed. I promise I can still talk. Now, single-threaded performance is probably something many people are going to be considering if they buy this 5900X, especially pitted against the 10900K. Well, AMD actually claimed in the Cinebench R20 single-threaded test, it actually scored a score of 631 points, as opposed to the Core i9 10900K, which scored a measly 544 points. Of course, you have to take this with a grain of salt, as always, but I see no reason to not believe it because it seems to tally with other benchmarks ran on the 10900K. So again, talking points again, score, IPC can be more important than core clock. I mean, the 10900K operates at around 500 megahertz faster, but yet it saw a lower score. It's an AVX instruction set, so maybe you do have to deduct 200 megahertz here and there, but other than that, it's still got beat pretty hard, actually. Now, the MSRP of the 5900X is going to be $549 US. It's definitely not a cheap CPU. It's definitely on the higher end, more expensive CPU on the spectrum, but it's not the craziest thing we've seen, especially pitted against the Core i9 10900K again, which is you can usually pick up for around $600 to $700. This is definitely cheaper than that, but not cheap. Alright, moving down the list to the 5800X. Oh, by the way, I will get to the 5950X, but that's the last one, as it's definitely the craziest one among this lot. So, back to the 5800X. It has 8 cores, 16 threads, and it has a base clock of 3.8 gigahertz and a max boost clock of 4.7 gigahertz, so definitely no slouch when it comes to clock speeds either, and 105 watt TDP. Now, it has an MSRP of $449, and while it's definitely not on the cheap side or the more mid-range side, but I still feel like it's the CPU that's definitely going to be targeted by consumers, because it's probably the one that grants you the most performance for your dollar. Now, speaking for performance for your dollar, there's the R5 5600X, which is basically replacing the R5 3600. And as you all know, the R5 3600 was a great CPU for the price, and it was a super popular one among consumers, and rightly so. I'm actually using it in my system. But the 5600 XT has 6 cores, 12 threads, just like the R5 3600. It has a slightly higher base clock at 3.7 gigahertz, and a slightly higher boost clock of 4.6 gigahertz. So one thing you'll notice here is that on this new 5000 series lineup, it's definitely breaking that 4.2 gigahertz barrier that we saw on Zen 2. So it has a 65 watt TDP, the same as the R5 3600, which is again pretty awesome that you're getting, that it's kicking out the same amount of heat as the R5 3600, but you're getting better performance for your watt. And the MSRP for this one is going to be $299 US. So yeah, definitely a little more higher price than the R5 3600. But this is definitely going to be the most bang for your buck CPU in the Ryzen 5000 series lineup. The reason being, of course, that this delivers the most cores for your dollar, the most amount of performance for the average consumer for your dollar. So $299 for a CPU definitely isn't cheap. Again, it's not cheap, but it definitely bridges the gap between the Ryzen 3000 series and the Ryzen 5000 series, which I think is pretty important for those who don't really want to go with the 5800X, nor do they want to go with a Ryzen 5 3600, say. Another thing I kind of want to discuss before going to the 5950X is the TDP. Now, there's some people who are very familiar with what TDP is, but there's some who definitely might be a little bit confused. So, TDP isn't exactly how much power it draws. Yeah, it does give you a pretty good idea of how much power it draws, but that's not the be-all, end-all in how much power it uses. But one thing it does do is gives you a general idea of how much heat it kicks out, which is pretty important for picking out your cooler and things like that. So those two things are things to consider when choosing your CPU. The TDP isn't how much power it draws. Usually it draws more than what the TDP is rated for, and also that there's no standard for TDP measurement. Like Intel measures it based on their base clock, and well, it's a little more complicated than that, but they base it off of their base clock, while AMD bases it off of their off of the peak draw and boost clock, how much it draws under load and things like that. Now, I did mention cooler. Basically how this lineup is going to be is that anything with a 65 watt TDP or below is going to come with a Wraith cooler. We're not sure which cooler it's going to ship with, but it's definitely going to be a Wraith cooler. So we've known from the past that these Wraith coolers actually are pretty good at cooling your CPU. You can, on some, even overclock decently with it. I actually managed to overclock decently with it, but they're obviously not going to work for the higher end CPUs like the 5800X, 5900X, and upwards, because it kicks out so much heat that a stock cooler really will have a hard time catching up. And it's pretty understandable too. If you're going to spend that much, you might as well get an aftermarket cooler, probably an AIO. Alright, so now we can finally start talking about the 5950X. Now, this thing, be warned, is not for the faint of heart. It's for enthusiasts who absolutely need the best, or for those people who are, I don't know, 3D CAD designers by day, gamers at night. I don't know, something like that. It's definitely a very niche thing, the 5950X, but I can see where it would come in useful on quite a few occasions. Now, specs: 16 cores, 32 threads, same as the 3950X, but it has a 4.9 gigahertz max boost clock. No, it's so close to 5 gigahertz yet so far. Yeah, the day that 5 gigahertz gets achieved on Ryzen will be awesome once it happens, because it's a milestone, really. It has 72 megabytes of L2 and L3 cache. 72 megabytes definitely isn't any little amount, and it can definitely come in useful for things that are sensitive to this kind of cache-related stuff, so gaming being one of them. And all of that for a TDP of only 105 watts. It's the same as the 5900X, 5800X, which is pretty insane. And it even pulled off double-digit percentage wins against the 10900K in content creation, and even edged it out in gaming by a bit. Of course, this is these benchmarks and stuff are run by AMD themselves, so again, you need to take them with a grain of salt. But this thing is an absolute killer in gaming and content creation, and it's also a killer for your wallet. Of course, this kind of thing has a premium price because it's a premium product, and in this case it costs $799 US, and there's no way to sugarcoat this. It is very expensive, but it's not extremely exorbitant either. I mean, I can see it coming in useful, and especially pitted against a 10900K. Yes, it costs a couple $100 more, but it definitely, if the AMD's claims are right, I can understand why it costs $200 more. Woo, that was a lot of information. You guys should probably wait for actual benchmarks to come out before making any judgment call on what you're going to buy, because you should really base it off of facts that's agreed upon by many people. Now, yes, there's only 4 CPUs here, and I doubt that this is going to be the only 4 CPUs that AMD is going to have in their 5000 series lineup. But so far, they haven't confirmed any other CPUs. However, there is room for more lower-end CPUs, like, say, Ryzen 3 5300, 5100. There's definitely room for some lower budget CPUs there. And also, I just wanted to mention, I didn't want to say this previously because it might raise some confusion, but there's actually, AMD's actually, I think, planning, I don't know if they've confirmed or anything, but they're planning to make Ryzen 5000 series CPUs compatible with 400 series motherboards, so B450 and X470, but you'll definitely miss out on some features like PCIe Gen 4, some speeds and incompatibilities and things like that. But other than that, guys, that's all I have for you. Sound off in the comments down below. What do you think? Are you going to upgrade to Ryzen 5000 series CPU? I mean, this is a really compelling lineup that I see here. Just sound off in the comments down below. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about this launch. That's all I've got for today, guys. So if you liked this video, leave a like. If you didn't like it, leave a dislike. You know the drill. But if you did like it, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any more tech content like this. Other than that, guys, I will see you in the next video.